Back in 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy who was basically the master of Europe, led the biggest army the continent had ever seen into Russia. And what happened next? Well, it became one of the most unbelievable military disasters in all of history. So let's dive into the story of epic ambition, fatal miscalculations, and the absolutely staggering human cost.
So let's start with a number. Roughly 1 million. That's the estimated number of people, soldiers and civilians, who died in less than 6 months. To give you some perspective, that's like the entire population of a major city at the time, say Paris or London, just wiped off the map in a single campaign. The scale of it is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
And you know, behind a number that big, there are individual human stories. This quote here, it's from one of Napoleon's own top aides. It just paints this awful, gut-wrenching picture of those final days. Imagine being so cold and weak that just falling down meant you weren't getting back up, ever.
So this is the central question, right? How does Europe's greatest army, led by one of the most brilliant commanders in history, just vanish? How does that happen? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is a lot more complicated than the story you've probably heard.
Okay, to really understand this epic collapse, we have to go back to the summer of 1812. Napoleon is at the absolute peak of his power. And his goal? He needs to force Tsar Alexander I of Russia back in line to make him rejoin this thing called the Continental System. It was basically a giant economic blockade designed to crush his #1 rival, Great Britain.
And to get the Tsar to listen, he put together the Grande Armée. We're talking a colossal force of up to 685,000 soldiers. At the time, nothing like it had ever been seen in Europe. The sheer size of it was meant to be a knockout blow before a single shot was even fired. The idea was to be so overwhelming, the Russians wouldn't even think about fighting.
And here's what's so interesting. This wasn't just a French army, not by a long shot. It was this truly pan-European force. They even called it the Army of 12 Nations. You had soldiers from all over his empire. Poles were there, hoping Napoleon would help bring their country back. You had Germans, Italians, Swiss, even Austrians and Prussians, who were kind of forced into it, were all marching under his banner.
But here's the thing. This gigantic army carried the seeds of its own destruction from the very start. There was a fundamental, fatal flaw in its whole strategy, one that would cause everything to unravel long before the first snowflake ever fell.
You see, Napoleon's armies were famous for moving incredibly fast, and their secret was that they traveled light. His go-to strategy was to live off the land, meaning they'd just find food and supplies in the towns and farms they passed through. And this worked like a charm in the densely populated fertile fields of Central Europe.
But Russia was a completely different beast. And this comparison here tells the whole story. Napoleon's entire strategy depended on what you see on the left. Lots of people, good roads, rich farms. What he got in Russia was everything on the right. Tiny villages miles apart, dirt roads that turned into mud pits, and a Russian army that was burning everything behind them. It was a scorched earth nightmare.
And this is the point that just shatters the whole myth about the Russian winter. The army was already collapsing in the middle of summer. I mean, look at this timeline. In just the first 6 weeks, Napoleon lost almost half his men. After 8 weeks, a third of his main force was gone. And all of this happened before a single major battle was even fought. It's just unbelievable.
So, if it wasn't the cold, what were the real killers? Well, it was a horrifying cocktail of total logistical failure. You had diseases like typhus and dysentery spreading like wildfire because of bad water. You had outright starvation, men just collapsing from exhaustion on these brutal forced marches, and huge numbers of soldiers simply deserting. The army was rotting from the inside out.
But even with his army literally disintegrating around him, Napoleon just kept pushing forward. He was obsessed with taking Moscow, convinced it would force the Russians into that one big, decisive battle to end it all. And that showdown, it finally happened right outside the old capital.
The Battle of Borodino was just a slaughter. It was the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 men clashed, and in a single day, there were more than 70,000 casualties. Yeah, Napoleon technically won because the Russians pulled back. But it was the kind of victory that leaves you so battered you can barely stand. It didn't destroy the Russian army, not at all.
So a week later, Napoleon marches into Moscow. This was supposed to be it, the ultimate triumph. He's captured the historic heart of Russia. He's expecting the city leaders to come out, hand over the keys, and for the Tsar to start begging for a peace treaty.
But nobody came. Instead, he walked into a ghost town. The city was almost completely empty. And then, the fire started. The Russian governor had given the order to burn the city to the ground. Why? To deny the French any shelter or supplies. The grand prize Napoleon had sacrificed so much to win was turning into ash right before his eyes.
So Napoleon is trapped. He sits there in the smoldering ruins of Moscow for 5 long weeks, just waiting, stubbornly waiting for a peace offer from the Tsar that was never, ever going to come. His army was getting weaker by the day, winter was just around the corner, and he had marched himself right into a dead end.
On October 19th, his options were gone. Napoleon finally gives the order to retreat, and what followed was nothing short of a journey into hell. It would become one of the most horrific, infamous retreats in all of military history.
This chart really shows you the final, horrifying collapse. Just look at these numbers. He leaves Moscow with about 100,000 men fit for combat. By the time they get to the Berezina River for a brutal, desperate crossing, that number is cut by more than half. And the final number, the guys who actually made it all the way out of Russia, fewer than 10,000. It's just gone.
Now this is when the famous General Winter finally makes his appearance. The first real snows hit in early November, and they turned a desperate situation into an utterly impossible one. But it's so important to remember this. Winter wasn't the cause of the disaster. It was the final merciless nail in the coffin for an army that was already destroyed by bad planning, starvation, and disease.
The disaster in Russia wasn't just a military loss. Oh no, it was a political earthquake. One that would shake Napoleon's entire empire to its foundations and completely change the course of European history.
For almost a decade, Napoleon had seemed invincible, a force of nature. He had literally redrawn the map of Europe with his military genius. But out there, on the frozen plains of Russia, that entire myth was shattered forever. For the first time, he hadn't just lost, he had been catastrophically, completely defeated.
And once that myth was broken, the dominoes started to fall, and they fell fast. All of Napoleon's reluctant allies, like Prussia and Austria, saw their chance. They immediately switched sides and joined up with Russia and Britain. This new super alliance, the Sixth Coalition, was formed to take him down. And ultimately, they did. It all led to his final defeat and his first exile. The end truly began in Russia.
When you look at the final tally, the scale of the human tragedy is just immense. Napoleon's side lost about 500,000 men. But it's crucial to remember this wasn't a one-sided loss. The Russian Empire's losses, military and civilian, were almost as high. It was a catastrophe on a continental scale, for everyone.
Which brings us right back to the big question. Was Napoleon just a victim of bad luck and worse weather? Was he defeated by General Winter? Or was this disaster baked in from the very beginning, doomed by an ambition so massive, so blinding, that it completely ignored the harsh realities of geography and logistics? I'll let you be the judge.